presentation. These are a group of coal miners, and in the mid to late 1800s, they bought a coal mine to run as a worker cooperative. People who didn't like what they were doing blocked the road, tried to destroy the mine, and tried to get people in the local economy to not cooperate with them until they collapsed. This is an important story for us to remember, and I'm going to talk about some of the barriers in the road that we will experience as we move forward. Three barriers especially: the barriers of credit, the barriers of the tax system, and the barriers in your mind, which I hope you'll be open enough to discover. Let me begin by saying, because I'm not going to be talking all positive and smiley things, but more inconvenient truths, that I do go to bed at night, and I do dream that I will wake up and the whole world will be unionized worker co-ops. Okay, so just remember that as I say the other things that I'm going to say. Okay. When I was a young professor, a young lecturer at Harvard, and Jeff Weintraub, who was with me in the social studies department there, knows I worked with a group of other young professors at MIT and Harvard and other liberal arts colleges to found a worker co-op liberal arts college. Well, we almost succeeded. We got very, very close. But that's a very foundational part of my biography. So I want to make 2 points today. One, why worker ownership matters, and two, how platform cooperativism can grow it rapidly. So it matters because of this big idea, a property-owning democracy, which is not my word. We want to have a democracy where there's broad-based private ownership by citizens of businesses where they work, and the reason why we want to do that is because we know that economic power will control political power. And this was a basic idea of some of the idealistic versions of the founders of the American Republic. There's John Rawls' theory of justice. He popularized this idea of property-owning democracy. The platform cooperative movement needs to come to terms with the fact that if you want to have a property-owning democracy, well, you need to own most of the property. So what's our practical goal? I think the practical goal is that every enterprise in the United States has significant broad-based employee ownership or profit sharing. I don't think we can, especially right now, quickly develop the dream that I have every night. But we would want broad-based employee ownership or profit sharing to touch every sector of the U.S. economy. The 3,000 stock market companies on the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange, you should know, whether you like the company or not, that Procter & Gamble is about 25% worker-owned through a variety of worker ownership plans. Medium and large closely held companies, there's about 100,000 of them that control most of this small business sector. They could easily be transitioned to worker co-ops or ESOPs, and the millions of personal single-family businesses. So how are we doing now in terms of capital ownership? This data is based on really comprehensive data analyzing the tax returns of all the citizens of the United States by Sayers and Zuckman from the University of California, Berkeley. So we see in terms of the concentration of wealth, the concentration of capital ownership, the green is the richest 10% in the United States, and the red is the other 90%. Richest 10% have 77% of all capital ownership, all capital wealth, stock, bonds, real estate, all those assets. But there's another part of it, which is capital gains, right? Capital gains is the interest on bonds, how much stocks go up, and how much real estate goes up. This is even a more pessimistic picture from Sayers and Zuckman. The green shows that 97% of all capital gains, all interest on bonds, all dividends on stock, all capital gains on real estate, is now held by the richest 10%. Let me repeat that. 97% of all capital gains in the hands of the richest 10% now in the United States, 3% in the hands of the other 90%. Folks, we have to completely restructure finance, investment banking, the stock market, the bond market, stock market companies, those middle market small businesses in order to get this stream that we're talking to. So how are we doing with regards to worker ownership? These are data from the General Social Survey. Other than the census, the most significant survey of social behavior and economic behavior and attitudes funded by your taxes. You can see that in the blue, that 20% of adult workers own some share in the company where they work, and 80% do not. That's the good news, that it's as big as 20%. The bad news is that the median dollar value of worker ownership in the United States is just about $10,000. And to support a solid existence with benefits and savings, you're going to need to have more wealth subsidizing our flat wages. Now, how are we doing in terms of how much worker ownership is worth? Let's talk about worker cooperatives first. Remember my dream as I recite these figures, okay? According to a recent census, and these numbers may be a little bigger by now, Camille and I may have it out a little bit in the alley afterwards, but this is the recent census done by the Democracy at Work Institute. There were 310 worker cooperatives with around 7,700 workers. I recently put together a group of individuals who understand how to value companies to try to figure out what they are worth in total. And they're clearly worth less than $500 million. When I began this slide, I estimated the wealth per worker at $40,000. But I put together, I felt, the 5 best people in the United States who could help assess them. And I think the wealth per worker is closer to $20,000 per worker. Now, this does not mean that worker co-ops are not having what I think is their most historic moment in American history. But you're going to hear from me in a bit about how to get that $20,000, because it has to be a much bigger figure to affect this and this. Employee stock ownership plans. I know you've heard a lot about ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans. There are about 6,359 companies with 10.5 million workers worth $1.4 trillion. This is population data, the complete data from the records of the U.S. Department of Labor, with the average wealth per worker of $124,000. So I know you're immediately going to ask me, why the gap, right? Why so few worker co-ops in the United States? Why so few workers in worker co-ops? And why such a wealth gap? In my view, it does not have to do with the central characteristics of worker co-ops. I think it has to do partly, in way mainly, with some of those barriers I talked about. The barriers of credit, the barriers of the tax system, and the barriers in your mind. Worker ownership then, if you combine these two, right, $500 million, less than $500 million, and $1.4 trillion is less than 3% of total business value right now. We need really disruptive ideas to bring this up to 100%. So how do citizens get from here to there? I'm going to run through some quick choices, and then I'm going to tell you what's in the bag. Whoever guesses can take it home for their children. If you are going about to guess what animal it is, please write it down now, show it to your neighbor so you could present me proof so your little boy or girl can get this animal. Woo-hoo. Okay, sorry. I'm trying to. It actually isn't a live animal, so I am not violating any animal rights during the speech. So some possible choices. Make platform co-ops, worker co-op, ESOP hybrids. I'll explain that. Use credit to buy successful companies. Buy divisions of stock market companies that can be run online and immediately converted to platform co-ops. Yes, Nathan, I do support your effort to buy Twitter and make it a large worker ownership stake and, in fact, a worker co-op. Let's give a hand for Nathan and his other colleagues who have been writing about this. I wrote a commentary in Fortune magazine, for which I'm a commentator, trying to support Nathan's effort, and I plan to follow up with the second one soon. Create platform co-ops that offer full-time work and benefits, and then change state and federal policy. Yes, this is an Ewok from Star Wars. Who guessed what it was? Do we have any winners? No one guessed what it was. Okay, so this is an Ewok. We'll just put it right over here. Because I want you to remember my next point. There's a division, has been a division between the ESOP and the worker co-op communities, and I want this little stuffed animal to give you the message that that division needs to go away. If you are interested in democratic worker co-ops with some form of participative decision-making, that's a good thing. And if you are interested in using credit to buy existing companies that are not worker-owned and making them worker-owned, that's also a good thing, okay? Let's put them both together. Let's put them both together. ESOPs, briefly, are employee trusts defined under federal law, part of pension law, which are allowed to borrow money from a bank and then use that money to buy all the stock of a non-worker-owned firm and turn it into being worker-owned. Now, the interesting thing about this, it's like a mortgage, right? You borrow money and use it to buy something, and then you pay back the mortgage. The interesting thing about the ESOP is the company, through its profits and revenues, pays back the loan. So the workers, understand me, do not use their savings or wages to pay back the loan. As the loan is paid back, the shares are granted to workers. This is just the way, we buy our houses and apartments, right? We use credit, then we use our wages to pay off the asset, and we end up as owners. An ESOP uses a worker trust with credit to buy an asset, but the company that they're buying, its sales and revenues pay off the loan. The reason, my friends, why this number of 1.4 trillion in ESOPs is so much bigger than this number of less than 0.5 billion in worker co-ops, a large part of the reason is that most of that 1.4 trillion in ESOP assets use this way to get credit, to buy an asset, and have the income from the asset pay that back. Well, without mentioning any names, that's how a lot of people buy their casinos and build their big buildings, right? They don't dip into their pocket and use the cash in their money. Why can't the working classes have the benefit of this? So what I'm saying is we need to bring credit, we need to bring the advantages of ESOPs into the worker cooperative discussion. When I was a legislative assistant in the U.S. Congress from 1976 to 1981, I worked with Senator Russell Long's staff, and we, mostly through some of his very creative lawyers, we wrote it to federal law, this little animal here, the Ewok, because it was called, and you can Google it at the Cornell University Law School website, the Eligible Worker-Owned Cooperative. And what we basically did at that time is created an ESOP co-op hybrid in federal law, and it could still be used today. And I know Camille and others in the audience are working as lawyers on this ESOP co-op hybrid. It's something that is very important to taking platform cooperatives to a national scale. Using credit to buy companies. Now, I talked about those stock market companies. I'll talk about them in a minute. But I want to talk about the companies that you really want to buy in credit. There are about 100,000 small businesses between 50 and 1,000 employees in your local towns and neighborhoods and communities. And they're facing this huge crisis that there is no daughter or son, or there's a dumb daughter and son, to take over the company from the mom and dad. And it's sort of interesting. We know that we go to Thanksgiving and that our uncle or aunt who were founders of the small business are typically more conservative, and you want to really get into a big fight about politics with them. But let me tell you something. Do you know which part of the American economy created these 6,359 ESOPs with 10.5 million workers? Those conservative small business people sold their business to the workers. And why? Because we meaning a lot of people who worked on this legislation, mainly Senator Russell Long, who's now deceased. Yes, he was the son of Huey Long, populist of Louisiana, wrote into federal law that when a family owner sells to an ESOP or an EWOC, right, they are essentially excused from capital gains taxes. Now, I drafted legislation for the New Jersey legislature which would excuse all family owners from all capital gains taxes in the state of New Jersey if they sell to a ESOP or a worker co-op. And it would even include this little person here, the EWOC hybrid. I think another interesting situation that will get at those 3,000 stock market companies is to try to identify. And friends, this is where you're going to have to go get your MBA. You're going to need smart young lawyers like Camille. I think Camille is still really young. And you're going to have to figure out which divisions of those 3,000 stock market companies could really live online as platform co-ops without the brick and mortar, okay? And then you want to organize a buyout of those companies. And remember the rule. If you remember nothing else other than the EWOC, remember the rule. As long as the asset throws off enough income to pay back the loan, you can use the ESOP credit mechanism to buy it, right? That's the way big casino owners and builders of big apartment buildings in New York got their hands on those buildings. So this is something I'd like to see happen. Yes, I would like to see a division of IBM bought, put all the brick and mortar aside, and run it as a platform co-op. I would like to see a lot of consulting firms here in New York City bought and run as a platform co-op using the ideas that Trevor has taught you about for the last several years. Now, I think that the evaluation of buying Twitter is something which is interesting. As Nathan knows, I've differed a little with their plan because I'd like to see it as a ESOP, co-op, customer-owned combination platform. I do think that the ability to use this little EWOC here, in other words, to finance part of the purchase of Twitter with a loan to a worker trust is very helpful. I think that the idea that Nathan and his colleagues are thinking about is financing part of the ownership with customer buying stock, but I'd like to see the employees buy a lot of the stock of Twitter. Probably the most difficult discussion, I think, coming from a data point of view, and I'm not quoting all the studies and such. You can look in chapter 5 of the book if you want to read about a summary of 50 years of research studies. But probably the most difficult point, the most inconvenient truth, and there's actually another one that I need to go into, is that when I hear about a lot of the developments in platform co-ops, a lot of it sounds to me like bringing the gig economy to a platform co-op where the workers are still very part-time, not really earning, they may be earning a living wage per hour, but not earning a full-time wage and a full-time benefit. So I think that if we could use platform co-ops and the platform co-op ESOP hybrid, or EWOC, to buy some of those 100,000 medium-sized companies out there in a variety of industries, we know one of the things that this tells you here is that those workers in those ESOPs, what did they do? They bought more valuable companies, right? That's why they're worth $1.4 trillion. They bought engineering consulting firms. They bought small manufacturing firms. They bought companies like New Belgium Brewery. Anybody here, how many people have had Flat Tire beer? They bought W.L. Gore, which is 100% worker-owned through an ESOP. How many people have Gore-Tex on them today? They bought a firm that you may think is a boring firm, but please Google it, Amstead Industries in Chicago, which has tens of factories around the United States. People go to work and come home with dirty clothes, but you know what? They own their company through 100% ESOP, and they vote for their board members, and their board members democratically elect their CEO. Go to their website, Amstead Industries. It's the closest thing in the United States similar to the Mondragon Bass Cooperative, okay? Go check it out. But one of the problems, one of the reasons for the difference in pay and benefits, and another inconvenient truth I want to tell you, is that the data on average wages and average benefits in worker co-ops is not good data, okay? And it's not because, as I said, the worker co-op model doesn't work. It's because worker co-ops tend to be located, concentrated in industries that tend to have lower profits and lower wealth per worker. Retail, for example, and services. Now, I'm not saying let's not do worker co-ops in retail and services. I am saying let's use platform cooperatives to use the ESOP co-op hybrid to buy companies in a wide variety of industries. So I promised Camille that I would comment on her big goal of trying to transform the home health care industry. And this seems to violate my rules. So what would I say about that? What I would say is this: if in the home health care industry wages are fairly low per hour, and they're even fairly low per hour in worker-owned home health care companies, then sure, it's absolutely important that the platform, that the core company also be owned by the workers to supplement their wages with some capital wealth. But in addition to that, I think the really radical idea, let's not just do individual companies, let's take over the whole damn industry, okay? Let's get so much percentage of market share in the worker co-op industry that just like Pepsi and Coke, you know that bottle is not worth $1, right? It's worth 10 cents, but because they control the market, they can charge you $1 and you will pay $1 for those of you who still drink soda. So the same thing, let's have so much of the home healthcare industry worker-owned that we can lift to a very high level the wages and benefits in that entire industry. Let's make the whole industry valuable, okay? And that's something that you can do. You know that supermarkets operate on a very little margin. I don't know if any of you have ever walked into a Publix, P-U-B-L-I-X, supermarket in Georgia or Florida. Publix is 100% employee-owned through an ESOP. They have good wages and they own the whole thing. And through that combination, they're able to lift that industry a bit. But I think we can lift the home healthcare industry an enormous way. Now, we can change federal and state policy. I want to talk about a few things that's happening. First, I want to start with something that is really depressing, which is the current tax reform bill going through Congress. And I want to make sure you understand. Approximately every 5 years, the federal government creates what they call a tax expenditure budget. How much of what they could collect in taxes from corporations and businesses, they're going to give back to corporations and businesses by giving them tax subsidies and tax incentives. And that budget typically has run about $1 trillion every 5 years. That's the tax incentives companies get for accelerated depreciation and deducting all kinds of special things that they get to deduct. The current tax reform bill will basically spend between $1.5 and $2 trillion over the next 10 years, mostly on giving corporate tax subsidies to corporations. A variety of independent analysts say it will do very little for the middle class. Once the entire tax incentive system of the federal government is just gobbled up with tax subsidies to corporations, there's going to be very, very little left to encourage things like worker co-ops, ESOPs, and a variety of alternative economic futures. This is really, really bad news. If you want to read my Fortune magazine commentary, just Google my name and tax reform and Fortune, and you'll see that what I have said is that we should create a separate tax code for companies that have significant worker ownership and profit sharing. That is lower. If you want to cut taxes, sure, cut taxes for business organizations that share the wealth with their workers. That's what I would say. But unfortunately, it's not very likely that we're going to get there yet. The positive thing is that because of this moment, this platform co-op moment, this worker ownership moment, this employee ownership moment, there are a number of members of Congress coming together, actually on both sides of the aisle. You may be surprised to find that there's a large number of Republicans and Democrats trying to change the law to provide some better tax incentives for ESOPs. I work with a lot of legislators. I was the advisor to Secretary Clinton on her employee ownership, and especially I designed her profit sharing policy. And I've committed myself that every bill I'm involved in has worker co-ops alongside ESOPs in it. So there's a really interesting bill. You can go to the website of Senator Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin, which would create loan guarantees for ESOPs and worker co-ops, treat them equally. Would create an Office of Worker Empowerment in the White House to look at policy issues on these things, and would prevent those 3,000 stock market companies from deducting any of their executive pay unless they had a significant amount of employee ownership. There's a number of other bills. Senator Sanders has bills endorsed by Senator Elizabeth Warren to create a loan guarantee program for worker ownership companies. He also has a bill, again endorsed by Senator Warren and Senator Gillibrand here of New York, to create employee ownership centers, worker ownership centers like we have in Ohio and many other states around the country. So, as I said, the current version of tax reform may be one of those big barriers in the road, just like the barriers erected against the coal mine. I'm working on a very small part of this puzzle with my little hammer and my little Ewok. And the part of the puzzle that I'm working on is the part that deals with higher education. You know, we have millions of people going to business schools and law schools and sociology and econ and anthropology departments, and they don't know enough about these concepts. So what I've done is I've imitated something that some of you may have heard about. Many decades ago, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation decided that there wasn't enough going on in the humanities, and they created the Andrew W. Mellon Fellowships in the Humanities. So 10 years ago, I created a fellowship program which is coordinated at Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations, which, like the Andrew W. Mellon Fellowships in the Humanities, gives research fellowships to mostly young scholars in the humanities and the social sciences to do in-depth research on all forms of worker ownership. Well, today, it's advertised in the Chronicle of Higher Education. You can Google it. Beyster Fellowships, Kelso Fellowships. Our application deadline is December 31st. And we now have more than 120 academics who come together in 2 conferences a year. And through this little effort, I'm hoping that we can transform higher education. There's the book, and thank you very much for visiting with me today.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, because of a combination of our collective brilliance and the fire alarm and more, we are short on time for breaks. So let's make this a stretch break. Take a few minutes before we begin the showcases starting at 3 sharp. And we'll get on to some of the really exciting concrete projects that are in the works right now.